Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Space channel. Picture a ship built for a journey no one aboard will live to finish, and follow it through its first 100 years. In that single century, whole generations are born, grow old, and are laid to rest. The founders who chose the voyage die without ever arriving. An entire culture forms and drifts into something new. And at the end of all of it, the ship has crossed barely 1/100th of 1% of the distance ahead, the destination star no closer to the eye than it was on the very first night. Tonight we live through that quiet first century aboard, from the planets falling away behind, to the sun shrinking into an ordinary star, to the slow handing on of a small world from the ones who remember home to the ones who never will. If you find these explorations worth your time, a like or a subscribe helps the channel reach others who do. Thank you for being here. But for the next couple of hours, none of this is something you need to carry. Settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow. Let the day fade away behind you. Let's begin. The voyage begins in silence, in orbit, far above the world that built the ship. There is no countdown in the way we usually imagine it, no plume of fire, no roar that shakes the ground. A ship large enough to carry a whole society for centuries could never be lifted whole through an atmosphere, and so it was never on the ground at all. It was assembled in space, piece by piece, over many years, in the high orbit of the home world, or in the calmer orbit of a larger body nearby. By the time the founders arrive, the ship is already a small country of metal and glass, turning slowly against the stars, waiting for the people who will fill it. They come up in groups, over weeks and months, ferried by shuttle from the world below. Each arrival is quiet and ordinary. A handful of people carrying what little they are allowed to bring, stepping through an airlock into the place where they will live out the rest of their lives. There is no single dramatic moment of departure. There is instead a slow filling of the ship, a gradual gathering of the crew, until one day the manifest is complete and the last shuttle detaches from the hull and falls away toward home. That is the true beginning. Not a launch, but a letting go. The moment the last shuttle pulls away is the moment the ship stops being resupplied, the moment the people inside become, for every practical purpose, the entire human world that any of them will ever touch again. For a long while, nothing seems to change. The ship does not leap forward. A generation ship gathers speed the way a great weight is pushed, slowly and steadily, gaining only a little each day. Its engines are not built for a violent burst, but for patience, for a thrust so gentle it can be maintained for years without pause. In the first weeks, the ship barely seems to move at all against the familiar backdrop of the home world and its moon. But the motion is real, and it is relentless, and day by day the ship draws away from everything the founders have ever known. The homeworld is visible for a surprisingly long time, and this is one of the small mercies of the early voyage. In the first days it hangs behind the ship as a full disk, blue and white and unmistakable, close enough that the founders can still pick out the shapes of continents and the turning of weather across the face of it. They gather at the ports to look. Many of them look for a long time. They are watching the only home their species has ever had, and they are the last people who will ever see it this way with their own eyes. Then, slowly, it begins to shrink. Within weeks, the disk has become a small, bright circle, and the continents blur into a single mottled brightness. Within months, it is a brilliant point, brighter than any star in the sky, but a point all the same, with no width left to it. And within a few years, even that distinction is gone, and the home world is one light among many, findable only by someone who knows exactly where to look and exactly which faint star is the one that matters. There is no single night when it vanishes. There is only a slow demotion from world to disk to dot to a single point that the eye can no longer hold apart from its neighbors. The founders are the last people who will ever find that point of light and know, with certainty and without instruments, that it is home. Their children will be taught which star it is. Their grandchildren will take the teaching on faith. Inside the ship, the early years are years of work, and the work is mostly the quiet labor of making sure the world holds. Every system aboard was built and tested on the ground, in workshops and simulations, under the eyes of engineers who could always open a panel and start again. But nothing tested on the ground has ever been tested like this, permanently, with no dock to return to and no part that can be ordered from below. So the founders spend the opening years as much auditors as travelers. They walk the ship from one end to the other and back again. They check the seams and the seals. They read the gauges and learn what the normal readings are. They listen to the ship, to the hum of its machines and the sigh of its air handlers and the slow turning of its great structure, until they know by heart the particular sound their world makes when it is healthy. This matters more than it might seem. A person who knows the healthy sound of a thing will notice, years later, when the sound has changed, and noticing early is often the difference between a small repair and a slow disaster. The air must cycle, and it does, drawn through the ship and cleaned and returned, carrying away the breath of the crew and bringing back oxygen from the growing things aboard. The water must return, and it does, gathered and filtered and distilled and sent around again, the same water that will pass through every person on the ship 1,000 times over the centuries. The crops must come up, and in the first seasons the founders watch the farm decks with a particular attention, because a closed world that cannot feed itself is a closed world with a countdown running. And the reactors must hold steady, feeding power to everything, never faltering, because everything else depends on them. In these first years, the founders are learning, by living it, that their survival is not a single thing, but a web of things, each one holding up the others, none of them able to fail for long without pulling the rest down with it. There is a strange doubling in how motion feels aboard the ship. After the long push of acceleration eases, the ship coasts, and coasting through empty space produces no sensation at all. There is no wind, no rushing, no shudder of speed. To everyone inside, the ship feels perfectly still as a building. It is only the universe outside that appears to move, drifting past the ports so slowly that a person could watch for an entire day and see almost no change. The founders must hold two facts in their minds at once. They are traveling faster than any human beings in history, faster than anything their species has ever built. And they are sitting quietly in a room that does not move, in a world that feels as solid and settled as the ground they were born on. Both are true. The ship carries its own stillness with it, out into the dark. The sense of down, in these early years, comes not from the engines but from the turning of the ship itself. Most of the great vessel, or a great section of it, spins slowly on its long axis, and that spinning presses everything inside it outward against the hull, and that outward press is what the body reads as weight. The founders learn to live inside a turning world, where the floor is the curved outer wall and the sky is the axis overhead. But we will come to the strangeness of that later. In the first years, what matters is only that the founders can stand and walk and sleep in something close to the weight they were born under, because a body kept in true weightlessness for years grows weak, and the ship is meant to carry strong and healthy generations, not fragile ones. And there is one threshold, somewhere in these early years, that passes without ceremony but changes everything. For a long stretch after departure, a return home remains technically possible. The ship is still close, still slow, still within reach of a mission that might be sent to bring it back. But the ship never stops gaining speed and never stops drawing away, and at some point, quietly, the balance tips. There comes a day when the ship is moving fast enough and lies far enough along its path that turning back would itself take a human lifetime, that the journey home would be as long and as costly as the journey onward. After that day, there is no home to return to in any practical sense. There is only forward. No one may mark the exact moment it happens. But it happens, and once it has, the founders are committed in a way that no promise or contract could ever make them. The choice is behind them now. All that remains is the voyage, and the slow, patient work of keeping their small world alive as it carries them, ever more quickly and ever more surely, out past the edge of everything they have ever called home. The solar system is mostly empty, and this is the first thing the founders truly learn about the shape of their journey. From the ground, the family of the sun looks crowded, a neat diagram of planets strung close together along their orbits. From aboard a ship crossing it, the truth is different. The planets are tiny, and the distances between them are enormous, and for most of the crossing there is nothing outside the ports but the sun behind and the stars ahead, and a great deal of dark in between. The planets do not rush past the windows. They fall behind, slowly, over months and years, each one a diminishing landmark on a road that is almost entirely empty. The moon of the home world is the first to go. It is left behind almost at once, in the earliest days, a familiar grey face that swells briefly as the ship passes and then dwindles into the general brightness of the receding home. After that comes the long reach toward the next world, inward or outward, depending on where the planets happen to lie along the ship's chosen path. The alignment of the planets is a matter of timing and luck. A ship does not wait for a perfect procession, and so it may pass close to one world and never come near another. But if its course carries it past the red planet, the founders are given one last look at a world that generations of their kind dreamed of reaching. The red planet is a small ochre disk when the ship draws near, marked with pale frost at its poles and the faint tracery of its great canyons and volcanoes. For a while, it is a genuine world in the ports, a place with a surface and a shape. Then it too begins to shrink, becoming a reddish star, and then a fainter one, and then nothing in particular, another point swallowed by the dark. The founders may feel this loss more sharply than they expect. The red planet was, for so long, the near shore of space, the first place their species meant to walk. To pass it and leave it behind is to pass the last familiar name on the map and sail on toward names that mean nothing yet. Beyond the red planet lies the asteroid belt, and here the founders meet one of the great surprises of the crossing. In stories, the belt is a dense field of tumbling rock, a gauntlet a ship must thread with care, dodging boulders at every turn. The reality is nearly the opposite. The belt is so vast, and its members so scattered across that vastness, that a ship can pass straight through it and never come close to a single asteroid. The total substance of the belt, gathered together, would not make a body as large as a decent moon, and it is spread across a volume so enormous that the average distance between one sizable rock and the next is far greater than the distance from the homeworld to its moon. The founders cross the belt without ever seeing it as a belt at all. To them, it is simply another stretch of emptiness, indistinguishable from the emptiness before and after, and the only sign that they have passed through the fabled field of asteroids is a line on a chart. This is a lesson the ship teaches again and again, in every region it crosses. The dramatic pictures are wrong. Space is not crowded, not dangerous in the way a storm is dangerous, not a place of constant near collisions. It is mostly nothing, arranged around a few small somethings, and the danger it poses is not the danger of obstacles, but the danger of distance and time, and the slow wearing down of everything over the long years. The founders came aboard braced, perhaps, for a voyage of hazards. What they find instead is a voyage of patience, in which the greatest enemy is not any rock or storm, but the simple, staggering size of the road ahead. And the size begins to show itself in earnest as the ship moves outward. In the inner reaches, the sun is still warm and bright, still a presence that fills a good part of the sky and lights the ports with something like daylight. But with every stretch the ship crosses, the sun's light thins. Its warmth falls away faster than the distance grows, because light spreads and weakens with the square of the distance from its source, so that doubling the gap from the sun does not halve its light, but quarters it. By the time the ship has passed the belt, the sun already delivers only a fraction of the warmth it gave at home, and the founders no longer rely on it for anything. The ship makes its own light and its own warmth now, from the power it carries within, and the sun outside is becoming less a source of life and more a landmark, a bright thing behind them that marks where they began. The founders watch the inner planets fall away and understand, in a way no diagram ever taught them, how thin the habitable band of their old home really was. All the worlds their species ever knew, all the history and life and struggle of their kind, took place in a narrow, warm ring close around a single ordinary star, a ring the ship crosses in its first years and leaves behind forever. Everything beyond that ring is cold and dim and enormous. The founders are sailing out of the only warm room their species ever had, into the long, cold hall that lies beyond it, and the inner planets falling behind are the last furniture of that warm room, dwindling one by one in the ports as the ship carries them out into the dark. There is a particular quality to time in this stretch of the voyage. Nothing happens quickly. A planet that appears as a distant star may take months to grow into a disk, and months more to shrink away again, and between the planets there are long spans in which the view hardly changes at all. The founders learn to measure their journey not in the passing of landmarks, which are rare, but in the ordinary rhythm of life aboard, the turning of the ship's own day, the seasons of the farm decks, the slow accumulation of routine. The planets are only occasional punctuation in a much longer sentence, and the founders come to understand that most of the voyage will be lived in the spaces between events, in the quiet, in the steady hum of a world that is always moving and never seems to arrive. By the time the last of the inner worlds has faded, the founders have begun to make peace with the emptiness. It is no longer frightening, only large. They have stopped expecting the drama that never comes, and have settled into the true character of the journey, which is patience and attention and the daily keeping of a small warm world as it crosses an enormous cold one. The planets falling behind have taught them the scale of what they have undertaken. And there is a great deal more scale still to come, because the ship has not yet reached the outer giants, and it has not yet reached the true edge of the sun's domain. And beyond even that lies the vastest emptiness of all, the space between the stars, which the founders have only begun to approach. The outer solar system is where the true scale of the crossing reveals itself, and where the founders see the last great worlds their eyes will ever meet. Beyond the belt of asteroids, the road runs on toward the giants, and the giants are worth the long approach. If the ship's course carries it near the largest of the planets, the founders are given a sight that no picture ever quite prepared them for. The great striped giant swells slowly in the ports over weeks, a banded world wide enough to swallow 1,000 of their old homes, wrapped in belts of cloud that move at different speeds and shear against one another in long curling ribbons. Around it turns a family of moons, each one a world in its own right, some of them larger than the innermost planets, some hiding oceans of water beneath shells of ice. For a while, the ship seems to hang beside a small solar system of its own, and the founders look their fill, because they know that nothing this large and this alive will ever fill their windows again. Then the giant, like everything else, begins to shrink. And beyond it, if fortune places it along the path, comes the ringed world, which many of the founders find the most beautiful thing in the whole crossing. From a distance, its rings are a smooth, pale band, a flat halo laid around the planet's waist. As the ship draws near, that smooth band dissolves into structure, resolving into countless separate ringlets, thousands of narrow bands of ice and rock, circling in perfect order, some bright and dense, some so faint they are barely there, divided by dark gaps, swept clean by the pull of small shepherding moons. The rings are made of pieces no larger than stones and no smaller than grains of dust, each one a tiny moon on its own path, together forming a structure so wide it would stretch most of the way from the home world to its own moon, and so thin that from the side it nearly disappears. The founders watch the rings turn, and then they watch them shrink, and then the ringed world is only another fading point, and the last of the truly great worlds is behind them. Past the ringed world lie the ice giants, colder and fainter and farther apart, dim blue-green worlds that never grow to more than small disks, even at the ship's closest approach. They mark the outer edge of the planets proper, the last of the major worlds, and beyond them, the ship enters a different kind of space entirely. Here the sun is small and pale, no longer a source of real warmth, and the light that reaches the ports is thin and cold. The planets give way to scattered ice. The ship crosses into the broad ring of frozen bodies that circles beyond the last planet, a zone of dwarf worlds and countless smaller lumps of ice, the leftover building material of the sun's family, never gathered into a planet. Like the asteroid belt before it, this outer ring is mostly empty, and the ship passes through it without incident, without ever coming near the small dark bodies that drift somewhere out in the surrounding dark. And still, the ship has not reached the edge. Beyond the ring of ice lies a vaster region still, a great sparse shell of frozen worldlets that surrounds the whole solar system at an enormous distance, the birthplace of the long-tailed comets that occasionally fall inward toward the sun. This distant shell may reach a good part of the way to the nearest neighboring star, so far out that its most remote members are only faintly held by the sun at all, drifting on the edge of being lost. Crossing it takes a very long time, because it is so enormous and the ship, for all its speed, is still crawling by the measure of these distances. There is almost nothing to see. The bodies of the shell are small and dark, and unimaginably far apart, and the ship sails through them as through open emptiness. But this is the true outer country of the sun's family, and passing through it is the ship's slow transition from a traveler within a solar system to a traveler between the stars. The boundary itself, when the ship reaches it, is not a wall and not a line that anyone could see. It is a slow change in the nature of the space around the ship. The sun blows a constant thin wind of particles outward in every direction, and that wind carves a great bubble in the gas that lies between the stars, holding the interstellar medium back and filling the inner space with the sun's own breath. But the wind cannot blow forever. At some distance it slows and thins and finally gives way, and beyond that point, the sun's wind no longer reaches. That point is the true frontier of the sun's domain. On the near side, the ship sails through the sun's own outflowing wind. On the far side, it sails through the raw gas of interstellar space, the thin, cold material that fills the gaps between all the stars of the galaxy. The ship crosses this frontier without a bump and without a sound. No one aboard feels anything. But the instruments notice. The particles change, and the fields change, and the character of the near-nothing the ship is sailing through shifts from the sun's wind to the galaxy's own thin medium. It is a real threshold, perhaps the most meaningful one in the whole first century, because on the far side of it, the ship can honestly be called an interstellar vessel. It has left the space the sun rules. It is out in the open now, in the country between the stars, where the nearest star ahead is as far away as the sun has now become behind. And the space beyond that frontier is not truly empty, though it is as close to empty as anything the founders will ever cross. It holds a thin haze of hydrogen and helium, a scattering of atoms so sparse that a whole handful of that space might contain only a single particle, and a fine drift of dust, cold and dark, spread impossibly thin across the light years. This near-nothing is real enough to matter over the long run. A ship crossing it at speed meets those scattered atoms and grains one after another, year upon year, and though each meeting is tiny, the sum of them, across centuries, is a slow, steady wearing of the ship's forward face. But that is a concern for the ship's builders and its long, slow maintenance, and not something the founders feel from one day to the next. What they feel, when the ship crosses the frontier, is only the quiet knowledge that the sun is behind them now, in a way it never was before. The planets have all fallen away. The edge of the sun's country has been crossed, and the ship sails on into the true dark, with its own small warmth held carefully inside it, and the whole width of interstellar space opening ahead. Of all the slow changes that fill the first 100 years, the quiet demotion of the sun may be the one that reaches deepest into the founders' hearts. Everything else that falls away is a place they had only visited in imagination. The sun is different. The sun is the thing under which every human being who ever lived was born and grew and died. It made the days and the seasons, cast every shadow, warmed every morning, anchored every sky. And across the first century, the founders watch it become, by degrees, a star like any other. At departure, the sun is still the sun, a disk with real width, too bright to look at, filling a share of the sky and pouring warmth through the ports. In the inner reaches of the crossing it remains a disk, only smaller, a shrinking coin of fire behind the ship. But somewhere out past the giant planets, a threshold is crossed that no one can mark to the day. The sun loses its width. It becomes a point. It is still the brightest thing in the sky by far, brighter than any star the founders ever saw from home, but it no longer has a face. It has become, in appearance, a star. A brilliant one, a dazzling one, the unmistakable brightest point in the ship's whole sky, but a point among points all the same. And then even that fades. As the ship pushes on past the edge of the sun's domain and out into interstellar space, the sun keeps dimming, sliding slowly down the ranks of brightness. There comes a night, impossible to predict and different for every ship depending on its speed and heading, when the sun is no longer the brightest star in the sky, when some other star, nearer to the ship's new path, outshines it. That is a strange night aboard, if anyone is watching. The star that made them is no longer even the brightest light they can see. It has been overtaken by a stranger. And later still, deeper into the century, comes the final demotion. The sun becomes simply one modest star among the scattered thousands, no brighter and no more remarkable than 100 others, sitting in some pattern that the shipborne will grow up naming as a constellation without ever knowing that one of its ordinary points is the origin of everything they are. A person who did not know exactly where to look could never find it. It would be lost in the crowd, indistinguishable, an anonymous speck of light in a sky full of specks. Only the ship's instruments and the careful inherited knowledge of the crew can still say with certainty which faint and ordinary star is the sun. This is the change that most sharply divides the generations aboard, and the founders feel it as a loss that their own children cannot quite share. To a founder, the sun was warmth on the skin on a summer afternoon. It was the light that came through a window at morning. It was the maker of every dawn they ever woke to and every dusk they ever watched. To see it reduced to a point, and then to an ordinary point, and then to a speck that must be searched for, is to watch a face they loved recede into a crowd until it can no longer be found. Some of the founders keep looking for it long after it has become hard to find. They know its place in the sky the way you know the seat where someone used to sit, and they look toward that place with a feeling their grandchildren will hear about but never truly feel. Because the children born aboard never knew the sun that way at all. To the shipborn, the sun was always a point of light, always a fact in a lesson, always a star their elders spoke of with a strange and heavy tenderness that the young could observe but not inhabit. They cannot mourn a warmth they never felt. To them, the sun is simply the star of origin, an important star, a star with a story attached, but a star, one of many, hanging in a sky that has always been made of such things. There is no loss in it for them, because for them, there was never anything to lose. The sky the founders grieve is only the sky the young grew up beneath, ordinary and complete. By the end of the 1st century, the people who remember the sun as a sun are nearly all gone. The ones who felt its warmth, who squinted against its glare, who lived their first decades under its light, have grown old and passed, and the ship is crewed now by those for whom it was never anything but a distant star among stars. The great demotion is complete, not only in the sky, but in the memory of the crew. The sun has become, fully and finally, just another light in the dark, and the only people who ever knew it as more than that are the ones who are no longer aboard to say so. There is something almost gentle in how completely the change happens, how thoroughly the loss is absorbed. Nothing breaks. No one is harmed. The ship goes on exactly as before. It is only that the anchor of every human sky since the beginning of the species has quietly slipped its place and become one point among the scattered thousands, and the ship has kept moving, and the days aboard have gone on turning, lit not by the fading star behind them, but by a sun of the ship's own making, which is where we turn next, because a world that has left its star behind must find some way to keep its days. A world that has left its star behind must carry a sun inside it, and the generation ship does exactly that. Somewhere in its design is an artificial cycle of light, a system that brightens and dims the living decks on a fixed and faithful schedule, giving the population a morning and an evening, a day and a night, that have nothing at all to do with the faint real star receding somewhere behind the hull. This manufactured day is the only sun the shipborn will ever really know. It is a steady, reliable brightening of the corridors and the wide farm decks, a warm glow that climbs toward its peak and then softens and fades to a dim blue dusk and finally to the deep quiet of the ship's night. The founders may have set it to match the length and color of a day on the homeworld, out of memory and habit, tuning the light to feel like the light they grew up under. Their descendants keep the same cycle simply because it is the cycle, the only rhythm any of them has ever known. This is not a comfort or a decoration. The cycle of light is as vital to the crew as the air and the water, because the human body is built around it in ways that run far deeper than habit. Our sleep, our waking, the daily rise and fall of the body's chemistry, the rhythms of hunger and rest and repair, all of these are tuned by the regular turning of light and dark. A body kept in unchanging light, or unchanging gloom, begins to drift and sicken, its inner clock unmoored, its sleep broken, its moods unsettled. So the ship's lighting system is a life support system in its own right, as carefully tended as the reactors and the recyclers. It keeps the crew not only comforted but healthy, holding their bodies to a rhythm that the vanished sun once kept for their ancestors and now keeps for no one aboard at all. Some ships go further and give their manufactured year a turning as well as their manufactured day. The light may shift slowly across a long calendar, warming and lengthening toward a kind of summer, and then cooling and shortening toward a kind of winter, so that the population feels the passage of seasons even though nothing outside the hull marks one. The farm decks may follow this longer cycle, planting and growing and harvesting in turn, and the community may hang its festivals and its rituals on the turning of a year that the ship invents for itself. In this way, a world with no weather and no seasons and no real sky manufactures the rhythms that human beings seem to need, the small turnings that break the endless sameness of a voyage measured in centuries into something a human life can hold. For all that it works, the manufactured day is also a quiet reminder of everything the ship has left behind. The shipborne grow up having never seen a sunrise that was not a dimmer switch, never felt rain that was not released by a system, never stood in a wind that did not come from a fan, never looked up at a sky that was not the curved inner surface of their own turning world. They do not miss these things because they never had them, and a person cannot miss what they have never known. But the founders miss them, sometimes sharply. A founder standing on a farm deck as the artificial light comes up may remember a real dawn on a real horizon, the particular way the light of the true sun spread across a landscape, and know that the warm glow climbing the deck around them is a careful and loving imitation of a thing their grandchildren will never see. The ship gives its people a sun and days and seasons. But they are the ships, made and maintained, and the real ones are behind them now, dimming into the crowd of stars. Many ships keep a small window onto that vanished star, a live image held somewhere the crew can look in on it, a single steadily dimming point that the instruments still track and display long after the eye could no longer find it unaided. It is a way of keeping the home star present, of refusing to let it slip entirely out of the ship's awareness, even as it slips out of the sky. The founders visit that image often in the early decades, looking at the fading point the way one looks at a photograph of a place one can never return to. Their children visit it less. Their grandchildren may pass it without a glance, an old display showing an unremarkable star, its meaning worn down by distance and by time into just another fact about a place none of them has ever been. And so the ship keeps its days by a light of its own making, and the true sun becomes a thing kept behind glass, a tracked point, a story, a name. The rhythm of life aboard goes on unbroken, morning to evening to night to morning, faithful and steady, entirely disconnected from any star. In a real and literal sense, the ship carries its sun inside it, because the sun outside has become too far and too faint to light anything or warm anything or matter to anyone's day. The founders built it that way on purpose, knowing exactly what they were building. They knew their descendants would live and grow and love and die under a manufactured light, in a world that made its own mornings, and they built that world to be as kind and as steady and as much like home as they could manage, so that the people who would never see a real dawn would at least never lack for the gentle turning of a day. To carry a society for centuries, the ship must be a world, and a world needs a ground to stand on and a weight to hold its people down. Out in deep space, there is no planet to provide that weight, and a body left too long in true weightlessness slowly weakens, its bones thinning, its muscles wasting, its heart and its fluids drifting out of the balance that a lifetime under gravity maintains. A ship meant to carry strong and healthy generations, children who will grow straight, and elders who will keep their strength, cannot let its people float. So the ship makes its own gravity the only way anyone knows how to make it without a planet. It spins. A great section of the ship, or the whole of it, turns steadily about its long axis, and that turning is what holds the crew down. It works through nothing more mysterious than the tendency of any moving thing to travel in a straight line. As the ship's outer wall sweeps around in its circle, it presses against everything resting on it, pushing each person and object outward, and the wall's constant inward curve turns that outward press into something that feels, to a body standing on it, exactly like weight. The floor of this turning world is its curved outer hull. Down is outward, toward that hull. Up is inward, toward the axis around which the whole world turns. Stand on the inside of a spinning cylinder, and you are held to its inner surface as firmly as you were ever held to the ground at home, by nothing but the patient logic of the spin. The landscape this creates is unlike anything on any planet, and the shipborn grow up finding it perfectly ordinary, while the founders never quite stop marveling at it. Because the floor is the inside of a cylinder, it does not fall away to a horizon. It curves upward, on both sides, rising gently in the distance until, if the cylinder is wide enough and open through its middle, the far ground climbs all the way up and over, and a person standing on one side can look up across the empty axis and see other fields and other decks and other people, seemingly hanging upside down high overhead, going about their lives held down by the very same spin on the far side of the world. There is no true up in such a place, only in and out, and the sky is not a sky at all, but the distant opposite ground, lit by whatever runs along the axis, curving away in both directions into the length of the ship. The turning has its own quiet rules, and the shipborn learn them in their bodies before they can name them. Weight is not quite the same everywhere. Climb inward, toward the axis, up a ladder or a rising path, and you grow lighter with every step, because the spin holds you less firmly the closer you come to the center of the turning. At the very axis, along the still line at the heart of the ship, weight fades away entirely, and a person can float, hanging weightless at the center of a world that turns slowly around them. The children make a game of it, climbing to the light heights near the axis to leap and drift in a way their grounded elders find dizzying. And there is another rule, subtler still. Move quickly across the turning floor, walk or run or throw something, and a gentle sideways push nudges it off a straight line, a soft invisible hand that curves a thrown ball or tugs at a fast walker's step. It is faint, and the wider the turning world, the fainter it becomes, but it is always there, the signature of the spin, and the shipborn grow up compensating for it without a thought, while a person newly arrived from a planet would stumble and misjudge for weeks. The builders of the ship understood these effects and designed against the harshest of them. A narrow cylinder must spin fast to make a full measure of weight, and fast spin makes the sideways push strong and the change of weight with height steep, all of which the inner ear finds unsettling. So the ship is built wide, its turning sections given as broad a radius as the design can bear, because a wide world can turn slowly and still hold its people down, and a slow turn makes the strangeness gentle. The aim of the builders was always that everyday life aboard should feel as close as possible to life on a planet, that a person walking a corridor or working a field or lying down to sleep should feel a steady, ordinary weight and never a lurch or a drift. In the best of the great ships they came close, and the spin became something the body forgets, a background truth as unnoticed as gravity itself was to the ancestors who lived on solid ground. Yet the enclosed landscape shapes the shipborne in ways that go beyond the body. They grow up in a world with no horizon that recedes, only ground that curves up and over. They grow up knowing that if they walk far enough in one direction, they will come, in time, back to where they began, because their world is not endless but wraps around upon itself, a finite loop a person can cross in a day. They grow up with a sky that is other people's ground, with heights where things grow light, with the ever-present faint sideways nudge of the turning, all of it as natural to them as the fall of a dropped stone was to their ancestors. To them, this is simply what a world is. And when their elders described the world they came from, a world so large you could never walk around it, with a ground that fell away to a distant edge and a sky that was truly empty and open overhead, the shipborne listened the way children listen to a tale of somewhere impossible, a place too strange and too vast to quite believe in, though it is the place their own bodies were ultimately made for. The hardest problem the ship ever solves is not its speed or its gravity, but its air, and the endless quiet task of keeping that air fit to breathe. On the home world, the whole vast machinery of the planet's living surface handled this without anyone noticing, an ocean of atmosphere so enormous, worked over by so many forests and seas and countless growing things, that a person could breathe their whole life and never once wonder where the next breath came from or where the last one went. The ship has no such ocean of air and no such margin. It has a sealed volume, fixed and finite, holding a fixed and finite amount of the gases a human body needs, and every breath the crew takes changes that mixture a little, and nothing can be allowed to drift too far in any direction without the crew beginning to sicken. The ship must do the whole planet's work of renewing the air, in a closed box, forever, and it must do it without ever falling behind. The heart of that work is green. The ship breathes through its growing things. The crew, and any animals aboard, take in oxygen and breathe out the carbon that their bodies produce, and the plants of the farm decks and the gardens do the opposite, drinking in that carbon under the artificial light and releasing fresh oxygen in return. Between the people and the plants runs a great slow exchange, the animals exhaling what the plants need and the plants exhaling what the animals need, a loop as old as life itself, here shrunk down and sealed inside a hull and made to balance on a knife's edge. The forests and fields of the ship are not there for beauty, though they are beautiful. They are the ship's lungs, and the crew tends them with the care of people who understand that the air in their chests passed, not long ago, through the leaves of those plants, and will pass through them again. But the loop does not balance on its own, and this is what makes the air the ship's most demanding charge. The carbon the crew breathes out must be drawn down before it builds to levels that dull the mind and sicken the body, and the plants alone, in their slow green way, may not keep pace with every rise and fall of the crew's activity. So machines stand alongside the forests, scrubbing the air, pulling the excess carbon from it and feeding it back to the plants, or storing it away, holding the mixture steady when the living systems alone would let it drift. The oxygen must be held within a narrow band, high enough to keep the crew well and low enough to keep the ship safe, for air too rich in oxygen turns the smallest spark into a danger. And beyond the great gases there are the small ones, the traces that seep from materials and machines and bodies over the years, gases that mean nothing in a single day, but that would slowly poison a sealed world if they were left to gather. All of these the ship must watch and scrub and balance, ceaselessly, because the air is the one thing the crew cannot do without for even a few minutes, and a sealed world that loses control of its air has very little time. The founders learn the particular temper of their own ship's air across the first years and decades, and this hard-won knowledge is among the most precious things they will hand down. Every closed world drifts in its own way. The founders learn how their air moves through the ship, where it grows stale and where it gathers, how it shifts with the seasons of the farm decks and the rhythm of the crew's work and rest, what the early signs are when the balance begins to slip. They come to read their ship the way an old sailor reads a familiar sea, sensing a change before the instruments have quite confirmed it, knowing which small adjustment will settle a drift before it grows. None of this could be learned on the ground. It can only be learned by living inside the closed loop, watching it breathe, year after year, until its moods are as familiar as one's own. And it must be taught, carefully and completely, to the generation coming up, because the ship will need that same reading of its air for as long as it flies, long after the founders who first learned it are gone. There is a humility that the air teaches, and the founders feel it keenly. On the home world, human beings could act as though the air were infinite, as though the sky could absorb anything and renew itself without limit, and for most of their history they never had to know better. Aboard the ship there is no such illusion possible. The air is plainly finite, plainly precious, plainly dependent on the health of the green things and the faithful working of the machines and the constant attention of the crew. Every person aboard breathes with the quiet knowledge that their breath is part of a loop, that the forest gave them this lungful and will take it back, that the balance holding them alive is one they help to keep. It is a knowledge that the ancestors on the wide world never needed and rarely had. And it makes the ship, for all its metal and machinery, feel less like a vessel and more like a single living thing, breathing slowly in the dark, its people and its forests and its scrubbers all part of one great breath drawn in and let out, over and over, across the long years of the crossing. If the air is the ship's most urgent charge, the water is its most patient one, and the story of the water is a story about the same handful of substance passing through everything aboard, again and again, for the whole length of the voyage. The ship leaves with a certain amount of water, and it will arrive, centuries later, with very nearly the same amount, because in a sealed world, almost nothing is ever truly lost. What changes is not how much water the ship has, but where the water is, and what it is doing. And it is always doing something, always moving through the great slow circle that ties the whole living ship together. Consider a single measure of water aboard, and follow it around. It begins, perhaps, in a tank, clear and cool and waiting. It is drawn up to the farm decks, and given to the growing things, soaking into the soil around their roots, taken up into stems and leaves. Some of it becomes part of the plants themselves, part of the food that will be harvested and eaten. Some of it rises from the leaves as vapor into the air of the decks, where it is gathered again by the ship's systems, cooled, condensed, and returned. The water taken up into the crops is eaten by the crew, passes through their bodies, does its work of carrying and cleaning and cooling, and leaves them again as waste and as the moisture of every breath. And all of it, every drop, the vapor from the leaves and the sweat of the crew and the water in their waste, is gathered by the ship, filtered and distilled and purified until it is clean and clear once more, and returned to the tanks to begin the circle again. The same water that a founder drinks in the first year will be drunk by that founder's great-grandchild in the 2nd century, having passed 1,000 times through plants and people and machines in between. Nothing about this is wasteful or unclean, though it may sound strange to ears raised on a world where water fell freely from the sky and ran away down rivers to a sea. Aboard the ship there is no sky to rain and no sea to run to. There is only the closed circle and the machines that keep it clean, and the plain fact that the water which sustains the crew is the same water their bodies and their crops have used countless times before. The ship's purifiers are among its most vital organs, and they never rest. They take the used and fouled water from every part of the ship and give it back pure, over and over, holding the whole circle in balance. Because a world that cannot clean its water as fast as it dirties it is a world on a countdown, and the ship is built to run without a countdown, indefinitely. The founders come to understand water in a way their ancestors never did, and to hold it with a care that would have seemed strange on the wide world. To them, water is not a thing that falls from the sky and is gone. It is a treasure that circulates, a fixed and finite quantity that must be kept clean and kept moving and never, ever allowed to escape. A serious loss of water, a leak to space, a spill that cannot be recovered, is among the graver things that can go wrong aboard, because unlike the air, which the plants and the atmosphere itself can help replenish within the loop, water lost to the void is simply gone, and there is no rain out here to replace it. So the ship guards its water fiercely, sealing and reclaiming and accounting for every drop, and the crew grows up with a reverence for it that runs deep, a sense that the clear, cool water in a cup is a thing of great and irreplaceable value, held in trust and passed along. And the water does more than sustain the crew and the crops. It is woven into nearly every system aboard, doing quiet double duty everywhere the ship can arrange it. It carries away heat from the machines and the reactors, flowing through them and drawing off the warmth they shed, keeping the ship's temperature steady. It stands in its great tanks as part of the ship's defense against the radiation of deep space, a thick layer of substance between the crew and the sleet of particles outside, so that the water the crew drinks is also, in its stored mass, part of the wall that shields them. The ship wastes nothing, and least of all its water, and so the same substance that grows the food and slakes the thirst and carries the heat also helps to guard the living decks from the dangers beyond the hull. It is everywhere in the life of the ship, always moving, always working, the patient circulating blood of a world that has learned to lose nothing. The whole of it, the air and the water together, is what the builders meant when they set out to make not a vehicle, but a world. A vehicle carries its passengers and its supplies, and runs them down as it goes, arriving emptier than it left. A world does not run down. A world takes what it has and cycles it, endlessly, the air through the forests and the water through the tanks and the crops and the crew, everything returning to be used again, nothing spent that is not somehow recovered. The generation ship is a world in exactly this sense, a small, closed circle of life, turning in the dark. And by the time the first century is well underway, the founders have learned to live inside that circle, as their ancestors lived inside the great circles of a whole planet, trusting the loop, tending it, and passing to their children the knowledge of how to keep it turning. It is worth pausing here, at the middle of the ship's first century, to gather up what the Voyage has become. The founders came aboard from a wide, bright world and watched it shrink behind them to a point. They crossed the empty inner reaches and passed the last great planets, the striped giant and the ringed world, and left them fading in the ports. They sailed out past the edge of the sun's own wind and into the true dark between the stars, where the sun itself has dwindled toward the crowd. And they have learned, in the years of the crossing, that their survival rests on a set of turning circles, the spin that makes their weight, the green loop that renews their air, the patient circle that cleans and returns their water. All of it holds. All of it turns. And at the center of all these turning circles is the thing they have not yet fully considered, the plain daily matter of what the crew will eat, because a world that has sealed itself away from every field and every harvest of its origin must grow, from its own soil and its own light, every mouthful of food its people will ever have. The farm decks are the largest living spaces aboard, and they are the true foundation of the whole enterprise, because a ship that cannot feed itself has already failed no matter how well everything else may run. Growing food in a sealed world is far harder than it sounds. Harder than growing a single crop in a single field, because the crew cannot live on any one thing. A human body needs not merely calories, but a whole spectrum of nourishment, the proteins and the fats, the many small vital substances that a varied diet on the home world supplied without anyone having to think about it. The ship must supply all of it, every needed thing, from a limited set of crops grown under artificial light in a fixed amount of space. Variety is not a luxury on the farm decks. It is a requirement of survival. The ship grows many things because its people need many things, and the loss of any one staple, any crop that fails or falls to disease, can open a gap in the crew's nourishment that the others cannot easily fill. The soil itself, where the ship uses soil, is a living thing that must be kept alive, and this is a subtlety the founders learned to respect. A field is not merely dirt. It is a whole small world of its own, teeming with the tiny living things that break down the old growth and free its substance for the new, that keep the ground fertile and able to bear crop after crop. The ship must keep that hidden world healthy across the centuries, feeding it the broken-down waste of the crew and the spent remains of old harvests, tending the invisible life beneath the visible one. Some ships forego soil altogether and grow their crops with their roots, bathed directly in nourishing water, a method that saves mass and space, but brings its own fragilities, its own ways of failing suddenly and completely. Either way, the growing of food is never simply a matter of planting and waiting. It is the careful management of a living system nested inside the larger living system of the ship, watched and adjusted and defended, season after season, for as long as the voyage lasts. The rhythm of the farm decks gives the ship much of its sense of a turning year and much of its sense of home. The crops are planted and they grow under the climbing artificial light and they are harvested, and then the cycle begins again, and the community lives by that rhythm as farming communities on the home world once lived by the rhythm of their seasons. There is work to do in the planting and work to do in the harvest, and festivals perhaps at the gathering in, and a shared understanding running through the whole population that the food on every plate came from decks they can walk through, tended by hands they know, grown from seed the ship has carried and saved, and planted again across the years. The founders may have grown up in a world where food appeared in markets from unseen fields far away. Their descendants grow up knowing exactly where every meal comes from, having perhaps worked the very decks that grew it, in a closeness to their own sustenance that the wide world had largely forgotten. Against the ever-present danger of loss, the ship keeps a deep reserve, a hedge against the failure that the founders know will come in some form sooner or later. Somewhere aboard is an archive of stored seed and preserved life, kept cold and safe and unchanging, holding the patterns of every crop and creature the ship carries. If a crop line should fail, struck down by some blight or some slow drift of the growing conditions, it need not be lost forever, for it can be raised again from the stored seed in the archive. This reserve is one of the quiet insurances that make a centuries-long voyage thinkable at all. The ship does not trust its survival to the living crops alone, which can fail, but keeps their patterns safe in store, so that the green foundation of the whole enterprise can be rebuilt from the archive if the worst should happen. It is the same principle that runs through everything aboard, the principle of holding a margin, of never staking survival on a single thread, of building a world that can lose a part and repair itself and go on. And so the middle of the century finds the ship a working world, fed by its own fields, breathing through its own forests, drinking its own endlessly circling water, holding its people to their weight by its own slow turning. The great systems have been tested by years of use, and they hold. The founders have learned their world's temper and taught it or begun to teach it, to the generation coming up behind them. What remains to be told of the first century is less about the machinery of the ship and more about the people inside it, about the ones who chose this voyage and are now growing old within it, and about the new ones being born who never chose it at all and for whom this turning world is simply and only home. The founders are the only people aboard who ever chose the voyage, and that single fact sets them apart from every generation that will come after them. They stepped onto the ship as grown men and women who remembered the wide world with their own eyes, who had felt its sun and breathed its open air and seen its horizons, and who accepted, knowing exactly what they accepted, that they would spend the whole remainder of their lives inside a moving world and would die without ever arriving anywhere. No one made them do it. They understood that the destination lay centuries away, far beyond any life of theirs, and that the best they could hope for was to begin a journey whose end they would never see. And they came aboard anyway, and the hatch sealed behind them, and the voyage became their life. It is worth sitting with how extraordinary a choice that is, because everything about the ship's early culture flows from the kind of people willing to make it. The founders are, by the very fact of their being there, people able to work for an end they will never reach, to give their whole lives to something that pays off only for strangers not yet born. There is an old image for this, of a person planting trees whose shade they will never sit in, digging the foundations of a great structure that only their descendants will see completed. The founders live that image entirely. Every day of their lives aboard is spent building and tending a world whose purpose is a landfall none of them will witness, for the sake of people generations removed from them, people they will never meet and can only imagine. The whole logic of the generation ship rests on their willingness to do this, and to do it not in despair, but in something like contentment. Across the first century, the founders do the deep work of turning a spacecraft into a home. A ship as it leaves the builder's hands is a machine, a marvel of engineering, but it is not yet a place where people know how to live. The founders make it one. They set the routines of the days and the shape of the weeks. They work out how the community will divide its labor, who will tend the farms and who will mind the machines, and who will teach the children, and who will care for the sick. They decide how the ship will be governed, and how its disagreements will be settled, how the newborn will be welcomed, and how the dead will be honored. They establish, out of nothing, the 1,000 small customs that turn a crew into a society and a vessel into a home. Much of this is invented in the first decades, worked out by trial and argument and gradual agreement, and much of it, once settled, hardens into the tradition that will bind the ship for the rest of the voyage. The founders are aware of the weight of this, and the more thoughtful among them feel it as a genuine burden. They know that they are not only living their own lives but legislating for descendants they will never meet, that the choices they make in these early decades, half by design and half by accident, may shape the daily life of the ship for 1,000 years. A rule set now, a custom begun now, a way of doing things that seems merely convenient now, may become an unquestioned law of the ship's world long after anyone remembers why it was chosen. This awareness makes the wisest founders cautious in a particular way. They try to leave their rules flexible, to build institutions that later generations can reshape as they need, rather than fixing every detail in stone and imposing the tastes of the first crew on all the crews to come. They understand that a ship bound too tightly to the ways of its founders may not be able to bend when it must, and that a world which cannot bend across 1,000 years is a world that may break. And there is a particular grief that belongs to the founders alone, a sorrow that their children will never quite share because their children never had the thing that is being lost. The founders left people behind. They have parents, perhaps, or friends, or a whole wide world of people still living on the home world when the ship departed, and the founders know with certainty that all of those people will live out their lives and grow old and die while the ship is still in its earliest reaches, still barely begun on its journey. Any message from home takes longer to arrive with every passing year, the delay stretching from minutes to hours to years, until at last the exchange is no longer a conversation at all, but a one-way arrival of words from people who, by the time the words are heard, have long since passed away. The founders are the last aboard who ever knew the homeworld as a living place full of living people they loved. Their descendants inherit only the recordings, the archive, the story. And so the founders carry a double knowledge that shapes them all their lives, that their whole world is now this ship, and that the world they came from is receding every single day, further and more finally out of reach. The founders must govern a world that has never existed before, a closed community of a few thousand people, sealed away from any outside, ruling itself for life, with no possibility of anyone ever leaving. There is no true precedent for this on the home world. Every human community in history had somewhere else beyond it, some frontier or neighbor or open road, some pressure valve through which the restless or the unwanted or the merely curious could pass. The ship has none. Everyone aboard is aboard for life, and everyone their descendants will ever meet is already among them, and there is no elsewhere to go. The founders must build ways of living together that can hold under that pressure, not for a year or a generation, but for the whole length of a voyage measured in centuries, and they must do it knowing that every strain they fail to plan for will fall on the descendants who cannot escape it. The most delicate of all the powers the founders hold is the power over the ship's numbers. The closed world can support only so many people. Its farms grow only so much food, its systems renew only so much air and water, and if the population climbs too high, the whole balance is overwhelmed, the loops pushed past what they can carry. Yet if the population falls too low, the community grows fragile in a different way. Too few hands to do the necessary work, too few minds to keep the knowledge alive, and, over the long run, too narrow a pool of heredity to stay healthy. So the ship must hold its population within a band, neither too many nor too few, and holding it there means that the most intimate matter in human life, the having of children, cannot be left entirely to chance and desire. Births must be guided, encouraged when the numbers dip, and gently limited when they rise, across the whole span of the voyage. It is among the hardest things the ship asks of its people, reaching as it does into the most personal corner of their lives, and how the founders arrange it, and how willingly the later generations accept it, shapes the whole character of the ship's society. Bound up with the question of numbers is the question of heredity, the slow, quiet problem of keeping a small, isolated population healthy across many generations. A community cut off from all others, breeding only among itself for centuries, faces the gradual narrowing of its inheritance, the slow loss of variety, the creeping risk that comes when everyone is, in the end, related to everyone. The founders guard against this in two ways. They begin with numbers large enough to carry a broad and varied inheritance, a founding population deep enough that its variety will not quickly run thin. And they keep careful track of lineages, of who is kin to whom, so that the pairings that form across the generations keep the inheritance as broad as it can be, sometimes drawing as well on a stored reserve of preserved genetic material carried for exactly this purpose. Across a single century, the effects of all this are subtle and hard to see. But the founders are not planning for a century. They are planning for a voyage many times longer, and the careful habits and records they establish in the first 100 years are meant to protect a line of descendants reaching far deeper into the future than any founder will ever glimpse. None of these arrangements can depend on the founders themselves, because the founders will die, and this is the deepest challenge of governing the ship. Whatever the founders build must be able to outlast them, to pass whole and working into the hands of people who never chose the voyage and never agreed to its rules. The first crew chose to be here. Everyone after them is simply born here, into a mission set in motion before their birth, bound by laws they had no part in making. The founders' institutions must earn, again and again in every generation, the willing cooperation of people who never signed the original bargain. This is the true test of the ship's governance, harder than any question of farms or numbers, to build a way of ruling that does not merely command the born aboard, but holds their loyalty, that gives each new generation reason enough to keep the whole enterprise going, rather than let it drift or fracture. A ship whose people no longer believe in the voyage is in graver danger than a ship with a failing machine, because a machine can be repaired, but a community that has lost its purpose can unravel in ways no engineer can mend. So the founders spend much of their political effort building for succession, designing the passing of authority from one generation to the next so that it happens peacefully and predictably, without the struggles that have torn apart so many communities on the home world. They create the offices and the councils and the customs through which the ship will make its decisions long after they are gone. They think hard about how leaders will be chosen, how disputes will be judged, how the rare wrongdoer will be handled in a world where there is no prison to send anyone to and no place to send them away. And they wrap the whole of it in shared ritual and common tradition, the festivals and observances and remembered stories that bind any people together, because they understand that a society is held not only by its rules, but by the things its people share and celebrate and mourn in common. The founders, in the end, are trying to give the ship not just a working government, but a living culture, something the born aboard will feel is theirs, worth keeping, worth carrying forward. Whether they have succeeded is a question only the next generation can begin to answer, the first generation that never knew the home world at all. Across the whole first century runs a single slow certainty, quiet and constant beneath everything else. The founders are growing old, and the founders are dying. This is the true background rhythm of the 100 years, steadier than any machine and surer than any milestone. The people who boarded the ship as young men and women in the strength of their lives become, with the turning of the decades, the ship's parents, and then its elders, and then its oldest generation, the last few who remember, and then its memory, and then its history. There is nothing sudden in it. It is only the ordinary passage of human lives, playing out as it always has, except that here it is playing out inside a world that itself will long outlast every one of them. Somewhere in the later decades of the century comes a threshold more poignant than any boundary the ship has crossed in space. There arrives a day when the last person born on the home world dies. Until that day, however few they have become, there are still among the crew some who stood on a planet with their own feet, who felt real sunlight fall on their own faces, who looked up at a truly open sky and out at a horizon that fell away into distance rather than curving up and over. They are the last living thread back to the world the ship came from, the last who can say, from their own memory rather than from any recording, what it was to live on the surface of a world. And then the oldest of them, the very last, grows frail and passes, and with that single quiet death, the ship crosses a line it can never cross back over. After that day, every living soul aboard was born in flight. Not one of them has ever known anything but the ship. No alarm marks that passage. No system registers it. The lights come up on the farm decks that morning as they always do, the water turns through its circle, the community goes about its day. It is only that the ship has changed, silently and completely, from a vessel carrying people who left the home world into a vessel carrying people who merely heard of it. The home world, which was a memory for the founders, becomes for everyone now a story, an inheritance, a place known only through the words and images the founders left behind. The last living witness is gone, and the ship sails on exactly as before, unbroken in its routine, now entirely in the hands of the born aboard. It is imagined, in the histories that such a ship would keep, as one of the great milestones of the whole voyage, the moment the ship's people became fully native to the ship, no longer an outpost of the home world, but a world unto themselves. What the founders leave behind in the end is not themselves, and not even chiefly the things they built, but something harder to name and more important than either. They leave the knowledge of how to keep the ship alive, the deep, practical understanding of a world's particular temper that can only be earned by living inside it, and they leave it lodged in the minds and hands of the generation they raised. Across their lives, the founders labored to pass this on, to teach the young the sound of the healthy ship and the signs of the drifting loop, the feel of the systems and the reasons behind the rules, everything they themselves learned the hard way in the early years. The wisest of them understood that this handing on was their real work, more lasting than any structure, because a structure can be maintained only by people who know how, and the knowing is the thing that must never be allowed to die. A ship can lose a machine and rebuild it. A ship that loses the knowledge of how its world works is a ship in mortal danger, however sound its hull. And so the founders, as they age, become teachers above all else, keepers and passers of the ship's hard-won understanding. Some take on the special roles that a centuries-long voyage seems to require, becoming keepers of the records, keepers of the stored seed, keepers of the ship's own young history, each training a chosen successor to carry the charge forward in an unbroken chain meant to reach across the whole voyage. They spend their last decades not building anything new, but ensuring that what is known will still be known when they are gone, pouring their understanding into the young the way they once poured their labor into the ship. It is a gentle kind of ending, this fading of the founders into teachers and then into memory. They chose a voyage they would never complete, and they spend their final years making sure the voyage can continue without them, and then, one by one and at last all together, they let go of a world they will leave still moving, still whole, still faithfully carrying forward the thing they gave their lives to begin. The first children born aboard are, in a way the founders can admire but never quite join, the first true citizens of the ship. They did not choose the voyage, but neither did they leave anything behind, and this second fact matters as much as the first. The founders came to the ship trailing a whole lost world, carrying memories of open skies and distant seas that ache a little in the carrying. The shipborn carry no such weight. For them, the ship is not an exile and not a substitute for anything. It is simply the world, complete and sufficient, the only world there is, and they belong to it as wholly and easily as their ancestors belonged to the wide planet they can barely imagine. To the shipborn, the home world is a story. It is a blue place their grandparents spoke of, a warmth and an openness described in words and shown in old images, a home in the way a distant ancestral country is a home to someone who has never once set foot in it. They learn its name and see its pictures and hear the founders speak of it with that strange, heavy tenderness, and they understand, in an intellectual way, that it is where their kind began and where their own great-grandparents were born. But they cannot feel it as a loss, because they never had it, and a person cannot grieve a thing they never held. The blue world is history to them, not memory. The place that is real to them, the place that is home in the way home is felt rather than known, is the ship, with its curving decks and its climbing artificial light and its familiar turning weight. This gives the shipborne a way of seeing the world that no human being before them ever had. They grow up with an easy, intuitive grasp of things that no child of a planet ever needed to learn. The feel of the spin in their bodies, the way weight fades as they climb toward the axis, the faint sideways nudge of a fast movement across the turning floor, all of this is second nature to them, learned before they could name it, as natural as walking. They know the geography of a whole world that can be crossed in a day, a world that loops back upon itself so that every place is finite and findable and near. They know, without ever being surprised by it, that the air they breathe and the water they drink are made and remade by systems they can walk through and touch, that their world is a made thing, tended and kept, rather than a vast given backdrop that takes care of itself. To them, none of this is remarkable. It is simply how a world is. And space itself, the great dark that so awes and unsettles the founders, is to the shipborne merely the ordinary emptiness outside the walls. It is always there, and they rarely think about it, the way a person born beside the sea rarely marvels that the sea is there. The stars are the permanent scenery of their lives, unchanging, familiar, the same patterns their grandparents pointed out to them, shifted so little by a whole century of travel that the sky they grow up under is very nearly the sky the founders left with. Even the great mission, the distant destination and the landfall centuries ahead, is to them less a dream than a plain fact of existence, like a far-off season that will arrive long after they are gone. They do not burn to arrive, because arrival was never theirs to hope for any more than it was the founders. They simply live, in the world that is the ship, under the stars that are their sky, carrying forward without much fuss a journey that began before them and will end long after them. There is something the founders find almost dizzying in watching the shipborne, a sense of having made not just a new home but a new kind of person. The children are not lesser for having never seen a planet. They are, in their own eyes and in truth, complete, whole inhabitants of a whole world, wanting for nothing they know to want. If anything, it is the founders who come to seem, to the shipborne, a little haunted, a little marked by their memories, forever half-turned toward a place that no longer exists for anyone but them. The children love their elders and listen to their stories, but they cannot fully enter those stories, and as the years pass, a gentle distance opens between the generation that remembers and the generation that only knows. The shipborne are the first humans for whom the world and the spacecraft are one and the same thing, with no memory of any difference between them, a state of being that no earlier person ever occupied. And they will raise children of their own who will be even more fully of the ship, further still from the blue world in the old images, carrying the voyage onward into a future where the home world is not even a grandparent's memory, but only a name in the oldest records, the faint first note of a story the ship keeps telling itself about where it came from and why it goes on. Teaching the shipborne is among the most delicate and most important tasks the ship ever undertakes, more important in its way than the tending of any single machine, because everything else depends on it. The young must learn to run and repair a whole world, and they must learn to do it well enough to keep that world alive, and they must learn it as people who have never seen the world fail. This is the peculiar difficulty of educating a generation born into a system that works. The founders learned the ship in the hard years, when everything was new and uncertain, when a mistake showed its consequences quickly, and the reasons behind every rule were plain, because the danger was fresh. The shipborne inherit a world already running smoothly, its crises already solved, its dangers held at bay by systems that have hummed along reliably their whole lives. They must be taught to respect and understand hazards they have never witnessed, to grasp why a thing matters when they have never seen what happens if it is neglected. So the teaching must carry not only the how but the why, not only the steps of a task but the reason the task cannot be skipped. It is not enough for the young to learn which valve to turn and which reading to watch. They must understand, deeply and truly, what the valve is for, and what the reading means, and what would follow if it went unheeded, because a person who knows only the steps will, sooner or later, faced with something the steps did not anticipate, get it wrong. The founders and the teachers who follow them work to pass on genuine understanding, the kind that can improvise and adapt, and not mere habit, the kind that fails the moment the situation changes. It is slow, patient work, and it must be done perfectly in every generation, because the ship cannot afford even one generation that learns its world by rote without grasping it, one generation of hands that turn the valves without knowing why. The young must learn far more than the running of the ship, too. They must learn the whole inheritance of their kind, the knowledge and history and art of the homeworld, not because they will ever set foot on a planet, but because that inheritance is what makes them more than crew, what makes them heirs to a civilization rather than merely the operators of a machine. They learn the sciences their ancestors built, the stories their ancestors told, the long history that led, at last, to the building of the ship and the beginning of the voyage. They carry forward a culture, and a culture unremembered is a culture lost, so the ship teaches its past to its future with great care, keeping alive across the centuries the memory of where it came from and the vast human story it is a small moving part of. And hardest of all, the young must be given a reason to care about a destination they will never see. This is the deepest challenge of all the teaching, because it cannot be met by facts or skills, but only by something closer to faith and belonging. The shipborn are asked to keep their world healthy, to do the endless work of maintenance and farming and care, for the sake of descendants as far removed from them as they themselves are from the founders, people they will never meet, arriving at a shore they will never glimpse. Nothing compels them to do this, except their own willing embrace of the voyage as their own. The whole enterprise depends, in every generation, on the young choosing freely to carry it forward, on their coming to feel the mission not as a burden laid on them by the dead, but as a thing that is theirs, worth their labor and their loyalty. The teaching must kindle that feeling, generation after generation, or the voyage falters. For there is a real and patient danger threaded through all of this, and the thoughtful founders name it plainly and plan against it. It is the danger that knowledge and care will decay across the generations, worn down not by any single failure, but by the slow erosion of time. Skills taught by rote can lose the understanding beneath them, hollowing out over the generations until people perform the motions without grasping the meaning. A system that never fails can come to seem unimportant, its upkeep treated as a formality, until the day it finally falters and finds a crew that has forgotten how to save it. Stories retold across 100 years can drift from fact toward legend, and the plain truths the founders knew can soften into half-remembered myth. The gravest long-term threat to a generation ship may not be any burst pipe or failed reactor, but exactly this quiet fading, the possibility that centuries into the voyage, the people aboard no longer truly understand the world they live in, or truly remember why they travel. The first shipborn are the first test of whether that fading can be held off. If they grow up capable and curious and committed, understanding their world and embracing their journey, then the pattern can hold and be passed on again. Their upbringing is, in the deepest sense, the most important experiment the founders ever run, the one whose outcome will echo down the whole length of the voyage, long after the founders themselves have become a story the ship tells its children about the people who first chose to go. Beneath the human story of the ship runs another story, ceaseless and unglamorous, and it is the story of a long, slow war against decay. Everything aboard wears out. Metal grows tired under the endless small stresses of use and fatigues and cracks. Seals age and stiffen and begin to let go. Moving parts grind themselves down, machines fail, surfaces corrode. The 1,000 components of a working world all march, at their own pace, toward the moment they will no longer do their work. On the home world this hardly mattered, because a broken thing could be replaced from a shop and a worn part ordered from a factory far away. The ship has no shop and no far-off factory. There is no port to sail into, no supply to call for, nothing beyond the hull but the empty light years. The ship survives only by being able to repair and remake nearly everything it contains, from its own resources, for as long as the voyage lasts. This means the ship must be not only a farm and a home, but a factory, and a remarkably complete one. It carries workshops and the means of making things, the tools that make other tools, the furnaces and forming machines and fabrication systems that can turn raw or salvaged material back into working parts. When something breaks, the ship does not reach for a spare from an endless store, because no store carried at launch could ever hold a spare for every part will fail across centuries. Instead, the ship makes what it needs, shaping a new part from its stock of materials, and when that part in turn wears out, its substance is gathered up and melted down and made into something else. The ability to manufacture, to take the worn and the broken and render it new again, is as vital to the ship as the ability to grow food, because a world that cannot repair itself is only slowly dying, and the ship is built to live. Underneath even the factory lies the deepest necessity of all, which is power, because nothing else aboard can happen without it. The farms grow under artificial light that power provides. The air cycles, and the water turns through pumps and systems that power drives. The workshops run, the ship holds its warmth, the very lights of the manufactured day climb and fade, all of it on power, and so the ship must carry a source of energy that can run for centuries without any refueling from outside. The most plausible such source is some form of nuclear power, drawing on a fuel supply dense enough and long-lived enough to burn for the whole voyage, whether by splitting heavy atoms or, if it can be made to run reliably across such spans, by fusing light ones as the stars themselves do. Whatever the method, the ship's power plants are among the most carefully tended things aboard, watched and maintained with a particular vigilance, because a lasting loss of power is the one failure the ship truly cannot survive. Let the power fail for good and the air stops moving, the crops go dark, the warmth bleeds away, and the whole closed circle of life collapses at once. So the ship never trusts its power to a single source. It carries several and backups behind them, and reserves behind those, layer upon layer of redundancy, so that no single failure and no unlucky run of them can ever leave the world cold and dark. That principle of redundancy runs through the whole design, and it is one of the great lessons the founders live by and hand down. Nothing critical aboard exists only once. The vital systems have their doubles, and the doubles have their backups, so that the failure of any one part is an inconvenience to be repaired rather than a catastrophe to be survived. And the same principle extends past the machines to the people, for the ship guards against the loss of knowledge as carefully as the loss of hardware. No single person's understanding is allowed to be irreplaceable. The knowing of every vital task is shared among several, taught and cross-taught, so that no death and no accident can ever carry away, with one life, some piece of understanding the ship cannot do without. The founders learned early that a world meant to last for centuries cannot rest on any single thread, neither of metal nor of memory, and they built and taught accordingly, weaving margins into everything. What ties the whole long war against decay together is not any machine or any store, but a habit of mind, a culture of maintenance that the founders establish in the first century and that must be renewed in every generation after. It is the discipline of constant attention, of walking the ship and watching for the small failures before they become large ones, of fixing the minor fault today rather than waiting for it to grow into tomorrow's disaster. A generation ship cannot afford a people who merely use their world and trust it to keep working. It needs a people who understand their world deeply enough to keep it alive, who tend it constantly, who repair by reflex and improve by habit and never let the small entropy of daily wear accumulate unwatched. A ship that keeps this culture healthy can, in principle, sail on forever, endlessly rebuilding itself from within, forever renewing what forever decays. A ship that lets the culture lapse is already in danger, long before any single system gives way, because the true machine that keeps a generation ship alive was never the reactor or the recycler or the workshop. It was always the skilled, attentive, understanding crew, made anew in every generation, keeping faith with the slow war that never ends. The space between the stars is very nearly empty, but very nearly is not the same as entirely, and the ship must reckon with the little that is there. Thin as it is, the interstellar medium holds a faint scattering of gas, single atoms of hydrogen and helium drifting so far apart that a whole roomful of that space might contain only one of them, and mixed through the gas a fine haze of dust, cold motes far smaller than anything the eye could see. To a body at rest, all of it would be beneath notice, a near-perfect vacuum. But the ship is not at rest. The ship is moving, and at the speed of a serious interstellar crossing, even the emptiest space becomes something the ship must defend itself against, because at such speeds the meeting of ship and particle is not gentle. The physics of it is unforgiving in a quiet way. When the ship, racing forward, meets even a single tiny grain of dust, the two come together with tremendous energy, all the energy of the ship's speed concentrated into that one small collision. A mote that would drift harmlessly against a still hand becomes, against the ship's forward face, a sharp pinpoint strike. The atoms of gas, one by one, are gentler still, but there are countless of them across the light years, and year upon year the ship plows through them, and the sum of all those tiny meetings is a slow, steady erosion of whatever surface leads the way. It is as though the ship sails into an endless, invisibly fine sandstorm, each individual grain nearly nothing, the whole of them, across centuries, a force that must be planned for and endured. So the ship leads with a shield. Its forward face, the surface that meets the oncoming dark, is built to take the punishment, thickened and layered and made to absorb the endless small impacts, and made too so that it can be repaired or renewed as it slowly wears away. The crew and the delicate heart of the ship ride behind that shield, sheltered in its shadow, while the leading edge takes the erosion on their behalf. It is a simple idea, the same idea as a windbreak or a prow, but at interstellar speeds it becomes essential, one of the quiet, constant demands the voyage makes, the endless, slow maintenance of the surface that stands between the ship and the fine rain of the medium it crosses. Beyond the dust there is a subtler and more patient danger, and that is radiation, the thin sleet of fast particles that fills interstellar space, streaming from distant violent sources and threading the whole galaxy. It cannot be seen or felt, and no single moment of it does obvious harm, but it passes through ordinary matter and, over a lifetime, over generations, it does its slow damage to living things. This is not a danger like a storm, sharp and passing. It is a chronic thing, a steady, faint exposure whose harm lies in its accumulation, in the total dose absorbed across a whole life aboard, and across the many lives of a voyage measured in centuries. The ship cannot let its people simply endure it. It must hold that exposure down, across the entire journey, for every generation, and that means the living heart of the ship must be wrapped in shelter. And so the ship is built with its people at its core, buried behind mass, the living decks nested deep inside layers of the ship's own substance. The founders and their descendants live surrounded by shielding, and much of that shielding is material the ship needs for other reasons anyway, doing double duty in the clever, sparing way the whole ship is designed. The great tanks of water stand between the crew and the outside, and water is a fine barrier against the particles, so that the same water the crew drinks and grows their food with is also, in its stored mass, part of the wall that guards them. The stores of food, the bulk of the ship's supplies, the very structure of its decks, all of it is arranged so that the mass which serves the ship's other needs also stands between the living space and the radiation of the dark. The crew lives in the sheltered center, in the safest volume of the whole vessel, while the outer layers take the exposure, and in this way the ship protects not only the founders but every generation to come, holding the slow harm at bay across the whole length of the voyage. There is a fittingness to this arrangement that the crew comes to feel, even if they rarely speak of it. The most precious things aboard, the people and the living world they carry, ride at the very center, wrapped and sheltered, while everything else, the shield and the mass and the outer structure, exists in part to keep that center safe. The ship is built like a seed, its life folded deep inside protective layers, carried whole and guarded across a hostile distance toward a soil it may one day reach. The dust wears at its leading face, and the radiation sleets against its flanks, and the ship simply endures it, patiently, layer by layer, sheltering the small, warm world at its heart. None of this is dramatic. It is only the constant, quiet work of a vessel built to cross the uncrossable, keeping its people safe from a space that would slowly harm them, so that the living circle at the center can turn on undisturbed, breathing and growing and passing itself from one generation to the next, all the long way through the dark. A society sealed away for 100 years does not stay the same society, and among all the changes of the first century, there is one that no rule can prevent and no engineer can manage: the slow, unstoppable drift of the ship's own culture into something new. The founders come aboard, carrying the whole culture of the home world, its language and its customs, its music and its manners, its ways of marking a day and a season and a life. But a culture cut off from its source and left to itself for generations begins, gently and inevitably, to change. It cannot help it. Every isolated community in the long history of the home world drifted this way, growing its own accent and its own customs whenever the seas or the mountains held it apart from its origins. The ship is more isolated than any island ever was, and across a century its culture drifts further and faster than any islands ever did. The language shifts first, and most quietly. New words appear for the things that belong to the ship and to no planet, for the decks and the systems and the particular features of a turning world, words the founders never needed and never had. Old words for the things of the home world, the words for rain and horizon and open sky, grow abstract and worn, kept alive in speech but drained of the concrete meaning they once carried for people who had actually felt the things they named. The accent of the crew changes by small degrees, the sounds sliding a little in each generation, until the speech of the shipborne, though still the tongue the founders brought, carries a music the founders would find subtly strange. Nothing is lost all at once. It is only that the language, like everything else aboard, is now the ship's own, adapting itself to a world its makers never imagined. The customs drift along with the words. the founders' festivals, brought from the homeworld, slowly changed their meaning, some fading because they marked seasons the ship does not have, others transforming to mark the events that matter aboard, the turning of the ship's own manufactured year, the anniversaries of the voyage, the milestones of the ship's own young history. New traditions arise that the founders never knew, born of life aboard, and old ones are kept but reshaped, their origins half forgotten, their forms carried on out of habit and belonging. The community's stories change too, the shared tales it tells about itself, until the ship's own past, its first birth and its first death, its early troubles and how they were met and mastered, becomes the deep common history that binds the people together, more real to them than the fading history of the world they came from. And the memory of the home world itself completes its long passage over the century from lived experience into inherited story. For the founders, it was a real place, felt and remembered. For their children, it was their parents' memory, vivid at second hand. For their grandchildren, it is a story in the old records, a blue world in old images, a name attached to the beginning of things. By the end of the 1st century, there is no one left aboard who remembers the home world with their own eyes, and so it lives on only as the ship chooses to keep it, in the archive, in the teaching, in the stories the community tells about where it came from. The home world does not vanish, but it changes from a memory into a heritage, from a place people knew into a place people are descended from, and that is a different and quieter kind of presence, honored rather than felt. Through all of this drift, the ship is becoming something it was never quite designed to be, and this may be the deepest thing that happens in the whole 1st century. It is becoming itself. It began as a piece of the home world in transit, a fragment of one civilization, carefully packed and sent across the dark. It becomes, across the 100 years, a place with its own identity, its own speech and customs and stories, its own sense of who its people are, no longer merely a vessel carrying a borrowed culture, but a small human world growing a culture of its own. The people aboard are still human, still the descendants of the home world, still carrying forward the great inheritance of their kind. But they are becoming, slowly, a particular people, the people of this ship, shaped by this turning world and this long voyage into something a little distinct from everything that came before. That gentle divergence is not a failure and not a loss. It is simply what happens when a piece of a civilization is set adrift and given time. The ship, carrying its people across the emptiness, is quietly turning them into its own, and turning itself, across the century, from a machine that carries a world into a world in its own right. At the close of the first 100 years, the ship has settled fully into the long rhythm it will keep for the rest of the voyage. The founders are gone, every one of them, and so now are many of the children they raised, and the people aboard are shipborn, and the children of the shipborn, generations deep into a world their great-grandparents began. The memory of the home world has passed entirely out of living experience and into keeping, held in the archive and the teaching and the stories. The systems that were watched so nervously in the first anxious years are simply the background of life now, tended by a crew that has never known them to be new, that has never seen them fail, that keeps them running out of an inherited and thoroughly learned habit of care. The ship has become a working world, quietly competent, carrying its small civilization through the dark, with a steadiness that would have reassured the founders, who are no longer there to see how well their world has held. And after all of it, after a whole century of lived human time, the destination is no nearer to the eye. This is the strange and humbling truth that the first 100 years deliver, the quiet fact at the center of the whole story. Generations have been born and raised and grown old and been buried. A culture has formed and drifted into something new. Every founder's entire life has been spent, and the ship has crossed only the faintest sliver of the total distance. A fraction so small it barely deserves a number, something on the order of 1 part in 10,000, a single 100th of 1% of the whole vast journey. The star the ship is bound for, if it can be picked out at all, looks exactly as it looked on the first night out, a point of light, no brighter, no closer to any human eye, unmoved by everything the crew has lived through to draw a hair's breadth nearer to it. 100 years, and the road ahead stretches on almost exactly as long as it ever was. There is no despair in this, though, or there need not be, because the ship was built by people who understood this arithmetic perfectly and chose the voyage anyway. The point was never to arrive quickly, and it was never, for the founders, to arrive at all. The point was to build a world that could keep going, generation after generation, for however long the crossing takes, however many centuries, however many lives. The first 100 years are the proof that such a thing is possible. They are the demonstration that people can be born and live full and complete lives and grow old and die aboard a moving world, and can hand that world on whole and healthy to the ones who come after, without ever seeing the beginning or the end of the road they travel. If the ship can do this for 1 century, it can do it for 10, or for however many the journey needs. The founders' true cargo was never themselves, and never even the machines they built. It was the pattern, a way of living that carries itself forward, 1 generation at a time, across a distance that no single life could ever hope to cross. And so the ship goes on. The lights climb on the farm decks each morning and soften each night. The crops come up and are gathered in and planted again. The water turns through its endless circle, from tank to field to crew and back to tank. Children are born who will grow old before the star ahead looks any different than it does tonight, and they will raise children of their own who will do the same, on and on, down the long generations of the crossing. Somewhere far behind, too faint now to find without the instruments that still faithfully track it, is the sun, 1 modest light lost among the scattered thousands, still keeping the empty place where the home world turns, holding the memory of everything the ship once was. And ahead lies a destination that 100 more generations, or more, may one day finally reach. Between the fading star behind and the waiting star ahead drifts the ship, a small, warm living world, carrying everything it is across the silent gap, no more than 100th of 1% of the way, and entirely, quietly at home in the dark. There is a great peace in that thought, if you let there be. A world that asks nothing of you, keeping itself alive out among the stars, needing no one to watch over it, content simply to go on. The founders are at rest now, their work long finished, handed on to hands they never held and could only imagine. There is nothing left for you to carry tonight, and nowhere at all that you need to be. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift gently outward, past the last faint light of the sun, into the quiet where the ship sails on. And let yourself rest here, in the stillness, as the little world turns and the long journey goes on without you. Sleep well and good night.